live. We're right.
Good morning, everyone. I declare this Kempsey Shire Council Extraordinary Council meeting open. It's the 30th of January 2024. I remind people attending this meeting that it is being webcast on YouTube with audio and vision, as a recording of the meeting is available on the internet and is required to be available for 12 months. Private recordings, including taking photographs by members of the public gallery, are not allowed. Please ensure all your devices, like mobile phones, are in silent mode, please. Councillors in attendance, from my left, Councillor Anthony Patterson, Councillor Simon Ferguson, Councillor Dean Saul, Councillor Arthur Bain. On my right, Councillor Alexandra Wyatt, Councillor Kinney Ring, Councillor Scott Butterfield, and Councillor Kerry Riddington, and also Deputy Mayor. Council staff in attendance are Mr Craig Milburn, General Manager, Mr Wes Trotter, Director of Utilities, Mr Michael Jackson, Director of Operations and Planning, Steve Mitchell, Director Corporate and Commercial, Mr Daniel Thorogood, Group Manager Governance and Information Services, Ms Sian Hunter, Governance Officer. And no other staff here. Oh, I could name other people, but they're in the public gallery. The core of this meeting is democratic decision making for the betterment of our Kempsey Shire community. There is one business item on the agenda with an extensive report with attached documents. Councillors have all done their best to be fully informed so as to make a considered decision on the item before us. With that, we will now commence the meeting. I'd ask Councillor Saul, please, to do the opening prayer, please.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. The Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power and the glory, for ever and ever. Amen.
Amen. The acknowledgement of country, could I ask Councillor Riddington, please?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Murrumboo. Kempsey Shire Council acknowledges the land of the Dunghutti Nation. We pay respect to elders past and present. We acknowledge the role of emerging leaders to continue to guide us in the future. We acknowledge the stolen generations and the need to change practices to be inclusive. This land always was and always will be Dunghutti land.
Thank you. Acknowledgement of servicemen, women and families. Councillor Bain, please.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I think this is particularly important considering what's happening currently in the Middle East. Council acknowledges servicemen, servicewomen and their families from the frontier wars, South Africa, Gallipoli and Kokoda, from Long Tan to Uruzgan, all other conflicts and humanitarian deployments. Thank you for your service.
Thank you, Councillor Bain. Thank you, Councillor Riddington and Councillor Saul. There are no absences, so we can skip item 4. Are there any disclosures of interest, please? There are no disclosures of interest. So we'll move on to the main agenda item of our extraordinary council meeting. Because it's an extraordinary council meeting, we do not have minutes to affirm. They will be affirmed at the February council meeting, which is on the 20th. Looking forward to it. But we have one report to council. It's 6.1, a special rate variation application supporting documents. There's a recommendation before us. I would wonder if anyone would like to move it. Councillor Patterson, please. And a seconder, please. Councillor Bain, thank you. Councillor Patterson, please. Would you like to speak to the motion?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'd like to put this recommendation that council receives and notes the submissions received during the public exhibition period as attached to this report and adopts the following documents, which will be attached to council's special rate variation application to the New South Wales Independent Pricing and Regulatory under S508A Local Government Act 1993. Those are the attachments of the long-term financial plan, the strategic asset management plan, the hardship relief to ratepayers procedure, and recovery of unpaid charges and other debts. And I look forward to my fellow councillors supporting this. And I have one question as I move along from one of the people in the public forum last night. And this goes through to possibly, Mr. Mayor, through to the General Manager in relation to Mr. Walker, who said that none of his letters were received.
Thank you, Councillor Patterson. I'm sure this can be explained quickly. Mr. General Manager, please.
Yeah, through you, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Walker's submissions were both received and they will both be included in the submission to IPART.
And to supplement that, the petition, all the submissions that were received for the SRV are all part of all the attachments that go with the application to IPART.
And just one more question.
Yes, Councillor Patterson.
If this wasn't to proceed today, would the SRV application still happen? I just want to clarify that for the public that this is just a amendment to that application. If that could be explained, please.
Yes, thank you, Councillor Patterson. The application was voted on at the November council meeting, and we voted 8-1 that it would proceed. So it's still proceeding. The attachments that we have had on public submission have received submissions, but if council decides not to adopt this motion before us, then we will have to put in the previous documents that did the same thing. So these are updated to address the SRV. So that's the situation. Councillor Bain, please.
Martinborough, Mr. Mayor, could I move that we go into Committee of the Whole?
You certainly can. Do we have a seconder for going to the Committee of the Whole? Councillor Riddington, please. Is there any dissent to going into the Committee of the Whole? There's none. Thank you. I declare we're now in the Committee of the Whole. So you get to speak multiple times if you wish. And we will stay in the Committee of the Whole till someone moves a procedural motion, we come out. So, Councillor Ring, you wanted to speak?
Yes, Mr. Mayor. I just had a question in relation to 6.1.3, 6.1.4, and that was just around waiving fees and what capacity council has to waive fees.
So this is in the hardship document?
Yeah. I just wanted clarification around that.
So could we look at that, please? It's on what page? Page 172.
Page 2 of the hardship, is it?
Yes, but it's also page 172 of the agenda. Just to unconfuse us a bit, Councillor Bain.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Mr. General Manager, please.
Dropped off. Through Mr. Mayor. Under the Local Government Act, council is not able to waive fees for general rates for general ratepayers. There are exceptions to that in relation to pensioners, and there's also a very limited exception to that when valuations have gone up considerably, and there's a significant impact from those. But as a general rule, we are not under any legislation able to actually waive rates.
Thank you, Mr. General Manager. Councillor Riddington, followed by Councillor Bain, and then Councillor Patterson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. Firstly, I'd like to thank all of our community for their submissions, both to the SRV and to these particular documents. I really appreciate their input. There's been a lot of work goes into it. There's also been a lot of work from council staff addressing issues and responding to them. So I really thank everyone involved. This has been a long and arduous and intensive process, but we need to read on these particular documents. My question, if I may please, through you, Mr. Mayor, probably to Director Mitchell. Would Director Mitchell please like to just give us a bit of an overview on how many people over the last, say, 5 years have applied for hardship provision, and also how many people have applied to have their rates paid by instalments?
Thank you, Councillor Riddington. Mr. General Manager or Mr. Mitchell, thank you.
Through you, Mr. Mayor. Councillor Riddington, in the last 5 or so years that I've been here, we would have had less than 10 applications for hardship relief. So very limited number. I guess what that does indicate is that, where possible, we'll work with ratepayers when they contact us or when they get into arrears to put in place repayment plans. In terms of the second part of your question, I can't answer in terms of how many over the last 5 years. What I can say is that at the moment we've got around about 230 ratepayers who are on payment plans currently.
Thank you. And further question, if I may please, Mr. Mayor.
Certainly.
And following up with Mr. Mitchell. There are for hardship and there are provisions for people to approach council to do instalment payments. My question really is, these particular documents go a long way to improve that process.
Thank you, Mr. Mitchell.
Through you, Mr. Mayor. Yes, that's correct. So we've had previous versions of both of these procedures that are attached to the council report today that have been in place, and they're the documents that have guided our debt recovery processes to date, and also then how we've applied the hardship relief. What we've endeavoured to do as part of the rewrite, if you like, of these two procedures is to try and make them clearer and more plain English than what they potentially were in the past, so that people who do have need in terms of hardship relief are clear in their understanding of what avenues are available to them. And what we will do and what we indicated as part of the November council report is that following this meeting and the application to IPART being submitted, is that we'll actually proactively communicate these policies to the community. It's fair to say that in the past there hasn't been a whole lot of promotion about these procedures. They've been available, they've been on our website, and so they're there. And then as ratepayers have contacted our rates teams, they've actually have pointed those ratepayers to these procedures if they weren't aware of them. But we probably haven't communicated or promoted those as much as what we intend to going forward. I guess that in the past is a commitment to try and make sure that the community and all ratepayers are aware of what avenues are available to them should they need to seek that relief.
Thank you. One more question.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you. So moving on to the recovery of unpaid debt procedures, could you please, Mr. Mitchell, just outline for our community how we deal with unpaid debt, and also the procedure for that, please?
Thank you, Mr. Mitchell.
Yeah, through you, Mr. Mayor. So the procedure is quite clear, I guess, in terms of the steps that take. I guess, conceptually what we will do is if ratepayers are in arrears, then there's a process that we'll go to follow them up. So they'll get reminder notices to let them know that if they are behind in the payment of their rates. Subject to then where they are in terms of that, then if they make contact with our rates team will talk them through what the options are in relation to that, and that may be setting up direct debits on a more frequent basis, because that may help people from a payment frequency perspective rather than having to make sort of larger quarterly payments, or indeed we'll then talk through them in terms of maybe setting up payment plans at that stage. If those efforts are not successful, and ratepayers are still not paying their rates, and that those rates become more in arrears, then that potentially will start the process around being outsourced for sort of legal debt recovery process. Obviously, then there's a process that we go through there. We use an external debt recovery agent to assist us in that. Again, trying to work with the ratepayer. So the processes they follow will be obviously to work with the ratepayer as best as possible to get them up to date, and so to get their arrears paid up. And so we'll work through that process. And the procedure steps out all of the steps, I guess, as councillors and community are potentially aware. Obviously, the very, very last step of that, which is obviously the absolute last resort, and what we would always try to avoid, is the sale of land for unpaid rates. Now, that only applies for a ratepayer with a property on it when they've got more than 5 years of rates in arrears. So it doesn't get to that step very quickly, and it obviously provides a lot of opportunity for council staff and for the ratepayer to work to try and to get that debt up to or in balance.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Councillor Bain, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Look, I've got quite a range of questions, and I might just ask a few and then give someone else a crack. So I'm going to start. I've got questions on the long-term financial plan, on the strategic asset management plan, and questions on the hardship and debt recovery policies and procedures. So I'll start off with the long-term financial plan. And one of my concerns is around depreciation. You know, we're looking at depreciation being about a 23% of our total annual expenditure, which it seems rather large. However, if we look at it compared to our assets base, it's around about 2.4%, which is reasonable. But so my quest to get to the questions, firstly, how is depreciation calculated? So I guess, you know, it's going to be different for different assets, but what guides us in that calculation? What discretion do we have in depreciating assets? Can we defer depreciation and reduce costs that way? And thirdly, what is the impact of the increasing value of our assets? Does that offset the cost of depreciation, or what impact does it have on that major expense of depreciation? Thank you.
Mr. Mitchell, welcome to that question.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Councillor Bain. So through you, Mr. Mayor, yes, probably just before I answer the specific questions, Councillor Bain, your comment is correct. Depreciation is a large item in our income statement, but that's on the back of the fact that we've got $1.3 billion worth of assets, and so we are largely an asset business with a lot of assets and community infrastructure. So hence that's why depreciation is an important concept. I guess in terms of how depreciation is calculated, at a very simplistic level, it's the value of the asset divided by its remaining useful life. So if an asset simply had a $100 value and it had 10-year life, you'd have a depreciation expense of $10 a year. It just reflects the cost of that asset over its life. And as I said before, with the large number of assets we've got 30,000 assets, that calculation is done on an asset by asset basis, because they'll all have their own value and have their own useful lives over which they're depreciated. So it is a large exercise to calculate that depreciation. In terms of discretion, we can adjust the useful lives, and extending useful lives can mean lower depreciation if that was the case. And we have in the past, based on reviews through our asset management staff, have looked at those useful lives and matched those to current service levels. And that, for councillors who were here a few years ago, they may recall our general fund depreciation did reduce by sort of $3.5 to $4 million based on that change that was made. However, it is really important to note that playing around with depreciation rates is not something that would be recommended at all. It's not good practice and can really misrepresent the actual state of the assets and the actual cost of those. So it's not something that it's done. The process that we go through in terms of determining those useful lives is based on expert advice and input from an engineering perspective. And importantly, those depreciation rates and the useful lives that are applied to calculate depreciation are subject to external audit. So on an annual basis, when our external audit happens, the auditors will look at those to make sure that they are reasonable as well. So there's controls around that as well. In terms of the third question, which was around increasing asset values, which I assume is largely related to when we have an asset revaluation, which we do periodically have to look at the value of the assets, and if those values have gone up based on the cost inputs, then those assets, their value increases. If you increase the value of those assets and you look at their remaining useful life, then that depreciation will change as well. And in the majority of cases, the revaluations that have happened over the last 5 years have largely resulted in an increase in the value of the assets that we have on our balance sheet, and that has then translated into an increased depreciation cost. There was one exception to that. Last year was in relation to, I think, our water assets, where there were some changes which actually resulted in a movement in the other direction. But largely, the experience over the last 5 years has been that asset values have been revalued upwards, and then that translates to a higher depreciation charge as well.
Can I have a couple of follow-up questions to that, please? Firstly, I get what you're saying about, the $100 example. Is there a difference in the way we calculate depreciation on disposable assets? So, for example, fleet and plant and equipment, and non-disposable assets, because we can't sell our roads and our bridges and well, unless you want to buy a bridge, but I've heard it done. But sorry, that's a bit facetious. Yeah, we can't sell our roads and bridges and our water infrastructure. So how does that impact? And also, we keep repairing things. How does that affect the life? How do you calculate the life of an asset when it's constantly that's constantly changing, really?
Mr. Mitchell.
Through you, Mr. Mayor. Yeah, so in relation to the first question, which was, sorry, you've gone a second.
Our liquid, disposable and non-disposable assets.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so in relation to those assets, they are all are depreciated in a similar way. It doesn't matter whether they are assets that could be disposed of, or are they assets that are community infrastructure like roads that you mentioned. So the process and the concepts are the same. They'll still have a carrying value and an estimated useful life, which will get reviewed regularly. And is subject to audit annually, so the concepts and the accounting principles are the same, and the depreciation therefore flows through our income statement in exactly the same way. Second question, sorry, I should have written these down, Councillor Bain.
Oh no, that covers both those.
Yeah.
That covers both those questions. And my last follow-up question on depreciation is. So the increasing value of our assets doesn't balance the cost of increase of depreciation. As our assets increase, the depreciation cost increases. That's correct?
Yeah.
And we revalue assets periodically, but I also believe that each year there's an indexation, which is not decided like that's. It's our assets are indexed and increase or decrease in value. Can you explain that indexation process, please?
Yeah. So through you, Mr. Mayor. So each 5 years we have to do a full revaluation of each asset category, and so in the year after next, we'll be back to our road and transportation assets and stormwater, which, as you imagine, is a really big asset category. So each 5 years we have to do a full revaluation, which is a large exercise, and we spread those out. So we don't do every asset category in the same year because it's an enormous body of work, and so we spread them out so that we can do sort of largely one category of assets annually. And so that's a periodic process that needs to be done. It's not to say that you can't do it more regularly. You tend not to because of the sheer volume of work, and that there's a cost associated with that. So we do it in accordance with that sort of 5-year cycle. What we also need to do is look at the fair value changes in those assets on an annual basis as well. And that's where the indexation concept comes into consideration. So and that's the situation that we've got at the moment, where a lot of the cost inputs have been going up on the back of the really high CPI and cost increases.
then the value of those assets may have increased, the fair value of those assets may have increased, and then we may need to therefore make changes on an annual basis, which comes as part of the indexation review, which is a requirement for us to look annually. What that does is it essentially means that you're not getting the shock every 5 years of a big change in the asset value. It largely will change progressively if there's been sort of a big enough movements that would require us to make those changes or to record those in our financial statements. In the past, when the cost increases have been a lot more steady, then the fair value adjustments hasn't been such a big issue. Where we're at now, because of what we've seen over the last couple of years, that process around fair value assessments and indexation has become a bigger consideration, and it just takes those shocks out from the 5-yearly revaluation cycle that I referred to.
Okay. Thank you. Someone else can have a crack.
Thank you. We all need to have a little go, Mr. Councillor Bain. Next person to speak is Councillor Patterson, but we also then have Councillor Wyatt after Councillor Patterson. Thank you, Councillor Patterson.
A number of questions as well, and I'll just put a few in and then come back if that's okay. This one may be through, if it's okay, Mr. Mayor. I asked this question through to Director Mitchell in relation to how our rates notice is divided, because I think that has a relation to what is proposed to be.
So you're asking what's on the rates notice that we're engaged with at the moment?
Yeah, well, how is our rates notice divided? Are we, for information for the public, are we applying to put the whole of the rates up?
Yes, I understand the question. Councillor, Mr. Mitchell.
Through you, Mr. Mayor. Yeah, thanks, Councillor Patterson. So, yes, this has probably been an item that we tried our best to communicate to the community in terms of the information sessions that we ran, in terms of the materials that were on our website, and you'll say Macleay as well. The special rate variation only applies to the property, the general rate, so the property related rate. The rates notice for most ratepayers will also include a number of other charges. So you'll have your water access charge, your sewer access charge. You'll also have water usage, waste, environmental levy, and stormwater levy. So there's a number of other charges that are on a ratepayer's rates notice. What we're talking about today and what we have been talking about in relation to the special rate variation only applies to that general property rates. So all those other ones, the other sort of 7 I referred to, are not subject to the proposed 42.7% increase. They are separate to that. And so this process and what IPART will consider will only be that potential increase that applies to the general property rate only. And it's an important point to make, because I think there's been a little bit of uncertainty or misunderstanding for some ratepayers where they think that will apply to their total rates bill.
Yeah, the confusion of people, say, paying a $3,500 rates notice, getting a 47% increase is quite shocking when that's not
43.
Yeah, it's not the actual reality. And just while we're on that, the average, I know that council has it, and it's also available to the public, about a graph that actually shows us what the average rate increase will be and what is proposed. The proposal from council, I believe, is approximately $40 per year, and then the increase proposed by council, by the government. Sorry,
so,
through to you, Mr. Mitchell.
Yes, Mr. Mitchell, you might explain the $40. Is a question, I guess, being put to you. Thank you.
Yep, through you, Mr. Mayor. Yep, Councillor Patterson. There's a page which I would draw everybody's attention to, which is in the long-term financial plan. It's on page 23, where what we have endeavoured to do is to outline the changes that are proposed, both in terms of the recommended SRV option, but also what we refer to as the base case would be, so with no SRV. And so if you were to go to that table that's on page 23, the long-term financial plan, it sets out what the rates would be across the 4 rating categories over the next 3 years, plus this year as a reference point.
about what the average for each of those rating categories, the rates would be, based on the application of the rate peg only. So the 4.7% rate peg that IPART announced in November, that table applies that 4.7% across those rating categories on an average bill for each of those rate categories, and shows what those increases would be. The table below that, which is SRV option 1, which is the recommended 42.7% across the 3 years, then shows the same rating categories for each of those years at the proposed SRV increases. In terms of the reference you made about the $40, that's in relation to the 24-25 financial year, so the financial year starting 1 July this year, and specifically in relation to the average residential ratepayer. So with the rate peg at 4.7%, an average residential rate would go up from $1,274 this year to $1,334 in 2024-25. So that's a $60 increase. If IPART were to approve the 7.9%, that increase would be $101, so an extra $41 for an average residential ratepayer. Now that differs depending on where you are in terms of your land value and what your actual rate is for your residential property rate. But that's, I guess, an indication across the 13,000 ratepayers. And again, I'd probably say, which we've done our best to promote, is that we do have a rates calculator that's on the website that people can actually put in their land value and actually see what it looks like for their specific circumstances. I mean, obviously we can't cover its report, so we've just used an average for that purpose. And for some, that will be greater than the additional $41. Likewise, for some, it would be less as well, depending on your property valuation.
Yeah,
Councillor Patterson.
I've just got 2 more questions. Just a question on pensioner rates. A few questions here. I understand. Well, pensioner rates are discount. Who pays for that discount? And will the pensioner rate go up by the full value of our SRV application? So 2 parts of that question.
Yes, Mr. Mitchell.
Mayor, through.
Thank you.
Through you, Mr. Mayor. So eligible pensioners, Councillor Patterson, are entitled to rebates, and so for their the sort of property rates and waste management, that's $250 per annum, and they also are entitled to an $87.50 rebate for both water access charges and sewer access charges as well. So there's 3 rebates that are applied to pensioners. 55% of that cost is covered by council, and 45% we get reimbursed for from that. So there is a cost, I guess, to council of our share of that, if that's what your question was. Yeah.
And just one last question about the payment plans. People that are on having difficulties with payment plans. Is it true? Do you think that the majority of those few hundred people that are on payment plans may not be behind, but just have selected to pay their rates on a weekly basis, which is an easier way to address their debits? Or is it, do you think that people on payment plans are all behind in rates? I know that's a general question, but
yeah, through you, Mr. Mayor.
Yes.
That's a difficult question, because obviously there's 230 different arrangements in place. Councillor Patterson, I'd have to look at that to be able to provide an answer on that one.
Yeah, thank you.
Just for clarity, Mr. Mitchell, the reimbursement comes from the state government, that pensioner rebate. We get 45% back of that. How quickly does that come back to us? Or do we have to put an account into the state government before it comes back? Or is it automatic?
Through you, audit process. So I think I'd have to double check whether that's just on an annual basis or quarterly, but it goes through a process where it's actually reviewed and then it's paid to us.
Right. So this is part of what is in the document earlier about cost shifting from the state government, which is putting costs onto councils. and that's one of them, is the rebate for pensioners. Thank you, Councillor Patterson. We'll come to Councillor White now, please.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks. First of all, I just want to go back to the depreciation question and confirm and follow up. And then I want to ask a couple of questions about hardship, and then I will let other people go, and then I have more questions about the other parts of the document. My brain works a bit methodical. I would like to go through one at a time, but we're not doing that. So I'll just go back to the depreciation. I just want to make a statement and then ask a couple of questions. So there seems to be a narrative around that the more grants that council gets is financially bad for the Shire. And I'm saying it's a narrative. I'm not saying it's true. I'm saying so there is a narrative out there that the more grants that council gets is financially bad for the Shire because of the depreciation. I feel that's like it's a catch-22 because our assets need replacing, modernising, and Stuart Point's case, it needs a brand new sewer treatment system. And so the issue of financial sustainability, why we're here, is because council doesn't have enough revenue to provide that it needs to do, particularly around infrastructure, assets, and services. And this is most of this, the big picture stuff, big items, is delivered through grants, some of which are tied to specific projects like the bridge replacement program, which has just been done or almost complete. Some are untied, like the federal assistance grants. And then we've got developer contribution fees. So, state and federal government don't say, Kempsey Council, here's a free bucket of money. They don't fund us. Like, they come through grants, those tied and untied grants. And comments around that narrative are grants a double-edged sword? Should we stop applying for them because of depreciation? Can you just provide a comment on that narrative, please?
Yes, I'll ask Mr. General Manager to have a go at this, please, because he loves grants. Thank you, Mr. General Manager.
Through Mr. Mayor, grants can be a two-edged sword at times with them. Some of them are obviously very, very beneficial. They certainly, overwhelmingly, they have a positive impact on the community and on the council. You raised the bridge replacement program, I think is a really good example. The grant we received to replace 56 of our timber bridges meant we can replace 56 timber bridges in 4 years as opposed to replacing 4 bridges a year, which we'd pay for loads out of ratepayers' funds. So we've been able to substantially improve those assets. What it does mean financially on our books, though, is that we've gone from having a range of timber bridges on our books to now having a range of concrete bridges on our books, which are obviously a lot more expensive. So therefore, the overall depreciation cost would be higher. Life expectancy of those bridges are probably 2-3 times longer than maybe even longer. So that depreciation is spread out over a much longer period of time. Where it becomes where the grants have a greater impact is if we are building brand new assets, the high performance centre. That wasn't a replacement program, that was a new building asset and therefore additional depreciation. The other side of that, though, we have an asset that now can draw in regional youth sporting events, range of functions, business meetings, things like that. So it adds to the economic benefit. It was a very strongly, and there'd be no way that would have been provided for our Shire in the project, and secondly, without that grant funding. So it really comes down to which particular grants, which particular projects, but overwhelmingly grants do have a positive impact, but also in terms of building our social fabric.
Thank you. Councillor White, anything further?
Yeah. Just a couple more following up with the depreciation and in relation to what Councillor Bain had asked. You've described, or Director Mitchell described, the formula to calculate the depreciation, which was the cost of the assets divided by the life cycle of the asset. And when we had a briefing a couple of weeks ago, and you just mentioned this as well, is that like the asset life, my understanding, the asset life cycle is determined through some industry professional, like a peak body or an agreed standard of practice or indexation. Is that correct? And can you give examples of some of those industry endorsed standards? So basically, you're not sitting around making it up. you are using some type of industry standard, which is adopted across the board. Can you say, like, what is that actually called? And can you give examples of some of those industry standards?
Mr. Jackson, please.
Through you, Mr. Mayor. The way that lifespan is assigned to assets does involve professional advice from industry bodies. So particularly people like the IPWEA, which is the Institute of Professional Public Works Engineers Australia. Sorry. And they provide guidance on the expected lifespan of different asset classes. However, ultimately the lifespan that we assign to those classes is has to be determined by council, because it is impacted by how much money we set aside for renewals on those assets. And so the state of those assets, the current state of those assets, following inspections, etc., and then also how much money we're devoting to renewals. So if we, for instance, were to devote more money to renewal, do regular resheeting of roads, etc., we would actually reduce the useful life, but would have a higher level of service. Or we could opt to not resheet that road and let it run for another 10 or 15, 20 years. By the end of its useful life, it will have a much lower level of service, but obviously the depreciation curve will be a lot longer. The and the lifespan would be a lot longer. So yeah, you do have to trade off the impact of depreciation versus useful life and level of service, because yeah, you can really change those things.
Thank you, Mr. Jackson. Councillor Wyatt.
Yes, that makes sense to me. So it's basically there is a benchmark standard, which might be like 30 years, and then council through decision making with budget allocation resources decide within that 30 years what level of service you're going to be, which then will extend that asset, which kind of leads into what Councillor Bain was talking about before as the continual asset valuation.
Yep. Thank you, Councillor Wyatt. Further question?
Yeah, I just wanted to go back to my original set of questions, which I was going to ask for this, which is the hardship questions. So yeah, just a few questions around the hardship policy. I just wanted to confirm first that, sorry, that's okay. I just want to confirm the Government Act sets some of the parameters around us to go in that hardship policy, and I'm wondering how much discretion does council have? For example, can we waiver fees?
Mr. General Manager, please.
As previously indicated, we aren't able to weigh rates. We can look at different fees in that, but what their hardship policy really is dealing with is more around our rates and our other fees and charges that are in place. And the debt recovery one, it was raised last night, had a minimum limit of $100 for example. That helps cover things where people haven't paid potentially fees such as food inspection for their premises and things like that, which are much lower fees. So we need to have this ability to follow up those lower base fees, and some of those may, under exceptional circumstances, be waived, but we cannot waive rates other than where I indicated earlier.
And is that because it's legislated that way in the Local Government Act?
Yeah, the legislation makes it very clear. It actually states that we are not able to waive fees. So it would be an illegal act to actually waive the fees. Sorry, to waive the rates.
I just got confused with those terms. Yeah. Paper then. There's one comment there that says, and I've just got cut and paste from the business paper, is that council's committed to developing and implementing a communication plan to increase of the hardship policy. Is this ready to go now, or this will be rolling out in the next financial year?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, this policy, once adopted, is ready to go. I'll get Mr. Mitchell just to outline the communications plan side of it, what we'll be doing with that.
Mr. Mitchell.
Through you, Mr. Mayor. Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, I think it was in relation to Councillor Bain's question, or one of the questions, when I think I said we haven't actively promoted these procedures or these provisions that exist in the past, but that's something that we are obviously committed to do and are working up. We have had our communications team, our rates team, and our customer service team have all recently done training series around ratepayer roulette, it's called, but in terms of giving updated advice on challenging circumstances. So we've sort of invested in some of our frontline staff to give them the skills to be able to assist and to work with those ratepayers where some of these challenging circumstances do exist. I guess in terms of the actual communication part, which I think is the bit that you specifically referred to, Councillor Wyatt, we will shortly have those materials pulled together. We'll have a dedicated section on our website that will talk to those procedures and link to those adopted procedures. We'll have an article in our rates household, so we'll obviously we get good reach from that to provide extra information in there, and also our customer service and our outreach engagement. So when we take out the chatterbox, etc., to provide information through those channels as well, so that people know what options are available and how they can contact council if they do have concerns around that. So I think this is going to be a fairly comprehensive plan. We will include references. I think part of some of the conversation we had in the briefing last night was around potential financial counsellors and how we potentially use those. We'll make references to those and where those services do exist. We haven't specifically put those in the procedures because sometimes they change, but we'll obviously be making sure there's general references around financial advisors. We can't give financial advice, but we can encourage ratepayers to seek financial advice, and through some services that community organisations provide as well. And our rates team do try to do that already. So when they have situations, they do work with the ratepayers that can. They're a really committed team, and so they're sort of doing that now. What we haven't done, as I said up front, was we haven't actively sort of communicated this, and that's what this next phase will be after the SRV submission's completed and it goes in.
Thank you, Councillor Wyatt.
Just two more.
Thank you, Councillor Wyatt.
Just noting this is around the independent representative, which is, I think it was Spadco might have raised that as a question, but meaning that there are privacy, respect and dignity considerations. Could an independent representative be part of that financial?
Mr. Mitchell. Through you, Mr. Mayor. We're confident council processes and the procedure are robust enough, and that they appropriately balance that need for hardship relief for an individual ratepayer versus the impacts on the broader ratepayer base. So we haven't proposed that. As you quite rightly, there are privacy issues in terms of sharing people's private information with people external to council, and so that would be a major consideration and a major factor, I think, and we've actually referenced that in the response that we included in the council report. I think the other thing I really want to highlight is that we've got a really significantly experienced team with, and they're dealing with rates collections every day, and so they are really well placed in terms of considering these applications and understanding where there is a genuine need for hardship, as there may not be as genuine a need. But I guess the fail-safe around that is that where hardship applications are received, that committee is chaired by myself, so it's got senior representation on that. That's not in any way a comment on the staff who deal with these things day to day, because their input is first class and taken into account. I guess from a governance perspective, that when we're dealing with these, that we've got appropriate senior management representation in terms of the consideration of those. And as I said, the 10 or so, the maximum of 10 that we've had, those meetings in terms of the consideration of any of those applications that are received, that there is, and the section 6 in the procedure does provide for, if a ratepayer is unhappy with the decision that's made, they can then contact in the procedure request go for consideration of the general manager. Now, we've never had to do that as we've worked through outcomes. And as I said, we've only had 10 cases such as this in the past, but there is that process as well.
Thank you. Councillor White.
So given that the answer is you can't have an independent there, but there's nothing stopping someone from bringing in an advocate if they feel uncomfortable or unsafe or too traumatised. To us, they can bring in an advocate from financial counselling to assist them in that process.
Yep, through you, Mr. Mayor. Yeah, and that's happened in the past. They don't necessarily bring them in. The committee, that's just an internal meeting. But absolutely, and as I said, our rates team will work with ratepayers, and part of that will be around encouraging them to seek support and to seek financial counselling and make use of the free services that are available. And there have been situations where we've had an application where it has had a letter of support from a financial counsellor that's been part of the materials that they've provided, and so absolutely would encourage those ratepayers, to do that.
Councillor,
Sorry, just one final one. You mentioned section 6 about sort of procedural review, but Speaker last night specifically mentioned an external appeal process. I'm pretty sure it was external appeal. Or an appeal process. What might that look like? And if not, why not?
Mr. General Manager, please.
Yeah, through Mr. Mayor, if people aren't satisfied once they've gone through our internal committee process and it's been escalated to myself, they're still not happy, they can then go to NCAT, which is the New South Wales Civil Appeals Tribunal. So there is actually an external appeal process.
Is that free?
I just follow up about Mr. General Manager. Is that in the procedure? If they could do that, or that just general?
I can probably talk.
Mr. Thorogood, please.
Yeah, sorry, through you, Mr. Mayor. Just to be clear, the process for appealing through NCAT is for powers which are in the regulation. So NCAT's jurisdiction only extends to legislation and decisions made under that is within their purview. So their ability to hear appeals on hardship is limited to those legislated provisions. It is a low-cost jurisdiction. Representation is prohibited before NCAT unless both parties consent to that representation being present, which means that it's to go into that forum and represent themselves. It is way less formal. Thickens and so on don't apply in the same way in NCAT as they do in a court.
Thank you, Mr. Thorogood.
If the hardship policy is developed in response to legislation, is it part of that appeal process?
Mr. Thorogood again.
Through you, Mr. Ware. So where that is a decision that is made about a legislative provision, i.e. a pensioner's eligibility or a person's eligibility for hardship conditions, then certainly that is something that's within their purview. If it's on a stipulation that we put forward ourselves, something in legislation, then they don't have the power to review that decision.
Thank you. Mr. Mitchell would like to add, please.
Yeah, just through you, Mr. Mayor, just probably like to add, I guess the way our procedures have been written, and I guess everything in terms of the way I've tried to answer is that we are genuinely trying payers to get the best outcome for the ratepayer, and to work with them if they do have genuine hardship challenges. And so there's a whole lot of ways that we will continue to do that, and are outlined in the procedures, trying to get to something that's a positive outcome for the ratepayer, but as it's referenced in the procedure, that also takes into consideration the broader rate pay. And so it's a real balancing act. I think I just want to be really clear, I guess from our staff's perspective, they are genuinely committed to trying to get the right outcomes, and I'm not saying there would never be a need for a process like that, but I guess I just want to emphasise the work that we do to actually get the right outcomes initially.
Thank you. Councillor White, is that yours for the moment? Or yeah, thank you. I'll come back to you. At the moment, we've got Councillor Riddington, Councillor Butterfield and then Councillor Bain again, please. So Councillor Whittington, thanks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. I'd like to go back to the documents in front of us. If we've got the Strategic Asset Management Plan, which I think is through you, Mr. Mayor, to Mr. Mitchell. Mr. Mitchell, prior to, did we have a proper asset management plan with a proper assets register that we knew the value of our assets?
Mr. Mitchell, please.
Through you, Mr. Mayor. Asset management plans and fixed asset registers that were in existence. Probably the point that is most in the last 5 years, we've made significant improvements and have really leapt forward in terms of our maturity from an asset management perspective. First and foremost around that was actually creating a team that actually was responsible for overseeing our strategic asset management. And that, includes, developing, our policies around that, our procedures around that. We've actually got now that's in place. We've got substantially better information and data. We've got a much clearer understanding of asset condition than we've ever had before. The finished product, no, but we've moved so far forward compared to where we were that we actually better understanding, and that what that means is that it helps us in terms of our forward planning. It helps us understand the financial implications of where we are now and what's needed in the future. And so those similar documents of similar but different, obviously, or they were no doubt in place. It's just that they've improved significantly in the last 5 years since then.
Yeah. What my question is that there has been an enormous body of work involved in this, and the focus has been on the actual assets that we've got, so we actually know what we've got, not what we think we've got.
Mr. Mitchell?
Yeah, through you, Mr. Mayor. Yeah, essentially, that's correct. Yeah, we've got a far better understanding of our asset position.
Yes, you may ask another question.
Thank you very much. So I am sorry for jumping around. I want documents before us, but we need to really have a look at the fact that this is an application to IPART. The council approved to do that. These are the attendant documents to support that application, along with the package from our community and all of our community's input, which I'm really grateful for. Council will make a decision in June about what will happen. IPART will give us their opinion, and council together in June will make the decision. Am I right?
As far as I know, that is correct. You've got it spot on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay. Further, just to go back to questions on our group of councils, there's different groups of councils at IPART rate peg. So therefore, our group of councils is 4.7% rate peg for 24-25. Could somebody please tell me how big a spread it is across the other councils, not in our group? What's the percentage that they got?
Yeah, Mr. Mitchell's going to try and give us some numbers. Thank you.
Through you, Mr. Mayor. I might not be able to answer the question Councillor Riddington, but the rate peg that was out was 4.7%. Now there are allowances now for population growth, and that will be council specific, not OLG.
Right.
Yeah.
Look, just to add to that, Mr. Mayor.
Mr. General Manager, Councillor Riddington, your microphone is off, so the people listening couldn't have heard that last comment.
Sorry.
Oh, I'm terribly sorry. It turned itself off. Yeah. That's what I wanted to know. Yeah. Thank you. And perhaps the gentleman for me, please.
Yeah,
I will ask the General Manager. Thank you.
Through Mr. Mayor, the actual spread of rate peg allowances for the 126 councils in New South Wales, allowing for the population growth and other factors, is from 4% up to 8.2%.
That's what I wanted to know. Thank you very much.
And spread. Thank you.
And also, just one more, please. And also, across New South Wales, Could the General Manager or Mr Mitchell please tell me how many councils have applied for or had approved rate increases?
In this financial
In
year
this-
or the future
The
past?
future financial year, please.
Well, we're not sure who's applying at the moment, but
No, but who has done it in the last 6 months?
okay. Thank you, Mr. Mitchell.
Through you, Mr. Mayor. So what we do know is that over the last 10 years, there's been 128 councils have applied for an SRV at least once. So, a large number of those councils have applied for a rate peg. There were 17 councils that had special rate variations approved for the year that we're currently in. So there were 17 councils that applied. 17 were approved. 2 of those were part approvals, but the other were fully approved. What we do know is that there's a number of councils which are through the process of applying for an SRV this year as well. In previous years, there was a requirement to formally notify IPEMBA. So in our case, it would have been November last year when we had the council meeting to formally advise our intention to apply. That requirement's been removed. I guess the unfortunate thing about that, who has actually applied, because IPART would then publish the list of all those councils who are intending to apply for a special rate variation. We do know that Griffith, Tamworth, Blaney, Narendra and Goulburn and Shoalhaven are applying. There were 4 councils that had intended to apply, and probably the most well-known of those being Bathurst, which I think we've talked about in the council meeting before, but also Blacktown, Murray River and Upper Lachlan Shires also have withdrawn their intention to apply for a special rate variation. So, there's at least probably 7 others that we're aware of, and they're potentially and likely is more than that. We'll have a better understanding of that, post the 5th of February, where at some stage IPART will upload all of that, and we'll get an indication of exactly who and how many are applying.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Right, Butterfield, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. This could possibly go through you to Director Mitchell. Councillor Patterson was actually talking about it yesterday, and I'm assuming most of the councillors here have had people approach them about the recent or the rate rises 23-24. It says here for 23-24 the IPART peg was 3.7%. What other charges or fees were added to the 23-24 rates notice, and why?
Thank you, Mr. Mitchell.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, there's probably 2 parts to answering that. I guess those other sort of alluded to in a previous answer will have also had some level of increase. Now, the majority of those have increased by CPI, and so for the 2023-24 financial year, so the year we're in, and for effect that took effect from the 1st of July, been a CPI increase applied to or in some cases might have been slightly different to CPI, but to all of those. I'd need to find the exact percentages for each of those, but it was part of the June council meeting resolution, would have actually specified those when council effectively made the rates, which is the name of that council report where they set the rates for the forthcoming financial year. I think just in relation to the property rates, Councillor Butterfield, and I'm not sure if this was a part of what your question was also considering was, the IPART rate peg was 3.7%. Now, for some ratepayers, that would have been what their rates had gone up by on their rates bill from last year to this year. For others, it would have went, and for others less, and that's purely because of the way the rates are calculated, where there's a fixed base rate component, which represents essentially half of the way we rate, and the other half, which relates to the technical term being the ad valorem component, which effectively is based on the land value. So if your property, and our materials as part of the SRV engagement process gave a lot of examples for this, particularly on a location basis when we went out to them, which actually said, so if you're, I think it was about 80% or 82%, the average property value based on the value of generous values. If your property had gone up by more than that, then it is likely that your rates will have increased by more than the 3.7% rate peg for the general. If your property went up by less than that, then you would have had an increase which was less than the 3.7%. Grew by 3.7%. If that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you. And also, maybe this go to Director Mitchell or the General Manager, but Mr. Walker, yes, so the council has no plan B for the SRV if it's rejected. What has been done so far and into the future where the SRV is approved or not approved?
Mr. General Manager, please.
Yeah, through Mr. Mayor. Council staff have been working through this with the councillors, obviously, for a number of years to work out where we need to go and where we need to head. We have had discussions with the councillors. What are the options of IPART refuse the application? We're confident that we have met all the criteria for the application to be approved. What would happen should we be told by IPART that the application is not approved? There's reasons behind that. We'd be looking at those reasons. If there was no future hope of a rate rise, we would be working with this council and the council that's elected in September to look at what expenditure that would focus across a whole range of areas, including our staffing levels, our fleet areas, what services in particular could either be reduced or cut. But there is no painless way of actually reducing this. We'll see the money we're talking about of that $8 to $10 million sort of thing a year out of the budget. That will come at considerable pain to the community because it will see a range of services reduced or totally cut, and we'd work through that with this council and the new council.
Thank you.
Councillor Bain, please.
Voting move, Mr. Mayor. Back to the long-term financial plan and looking at the projected borrowing. So there's a significant increase in borrowing projected over the 10-year period, and projected costs from $0.3 million in the cost of our borrowing this year to a projected $6.8 million in costs in 10 years. That seems a huge in cost. Is this affordable? And what might be the impact if we reduce borrowing potentially by staging projects until grant funding is available?
Mr. Mitchell, please.
Mr. Mayor, so probably make a few sort of general comments in relation to borrowing and the loans that have been included in the long-term financial plan. Pardon me. Probably worth noting is that the information that's included in the appendices to the long-term funds, and all three of those funds are ring-fenced and accounted for separately. And so the reason for making that point is that the long-term financial plan does include in relation to the sewer fund. Now, the operations of the sewer and the water fund don't impact the general fund and the special rate variation that obviously we've been talking about and is the subject of today's meeting. But it is important to point out that because we've got some significant projects that are in the sewer fund, and so if you're looking at it, the consolidated borrowings number, it is very, very large. We included a comment, it's in this version of the long-term financial plan and the one that went to council in November, very clearly acknowledging that the water and sewer fund forecast hadn't been updated for the purposes of this because from IPART's perspective, they're interested in the general fund and the impacts on the general fund. What we did note, the water and sewer funds, the forecast hadn't been updated, but we're going to there's a major piece of work that will be undertaken, result in those being updated. And so when we come to the April council meeting and our draft integrated planning and reporting documents, so our operational plan for next year and our long-term financial plan, you'll get a whole lot of additional work in terms of what next year's budget looks like across all three funds. That will be also then have some consideration around the sewer fund. No, the borrowings of that size and the ability to afford them is not achievable at the moment. But it's been does mean is that when we like we have had when we've had discussions with our local MPs, both state and federal, or with ministers, it does really indicate the size of the issue that we have in relation to the sewer fund particularly. Speak specifically now to the general fund. Yes, there are still, whilst the sewer fund probably dwarfs the general fund in terms of what we have in the base case long-term financial plan. So just as a reminder, the base case, any additional income that would come via a special rate variation, we do have significant borrowing cases sort of has included in there is to say, well, this is the income that we've currently got from all sources, including rates that have only increased at the 4.7% rate peg and then 2.5% every year beyond that. This is the cost that it costs currently to provide the services to the community that we're currently providing. So there's no real change in increases in terms of service levels. And then incorporates what we will need to spend from a capital expenditure perspective, particularly in relation to our road and transportation assets, where we know that to stop those assets deteriorating further, we have to spend a certain amount. Now, the three options that were included in the original SRV proposal had two larger increases, which for all as part of that consideration in November. But those other cases were to spend more money to improve the condition of our assets. What we've included now has got additional capital expenditure so that the backlog doesn't get any worse, and so that we're just sort of maintaining the assets, necessarily improving them. It's sort of maintaining the services at levels from road perspective where they're at. It doesn't totally remove the backlog. To remove the backlog, we would need to spend more money. We've included that capital expenditure in the absence of any income sources to fund that. We've shown that would via borrowings, and again, absolutely acknowledge that that's a large amount. There's been no decision to enter into those borrowings, but that demonstrates the case, and I guess in terms of making it clear to the councillors, to the community, then ultimately to IPART, why there's a financial need for us to have a higher level of income through a special rate. Mean that we've made a commitment to those borrowings. It's in there to demonstrate that that's what the borrowings would be required to do what we think we need to do at a minimum level. If was to be approved, then obviously the level of those borrowings would come down significantly because we would have additional income that would replace the need for some of those borrowings.
Mr. Mayor, I might just get Mr. Trotter to outline some of the work that he and his team are actually doing in relation to the water and sewer fund in particular, because that is where the significant, particularly the sewer fund. Just outline what they're doing in terms of staging, modelling, designing, those sorts of things, so the councillors and the community are aware of that.
Yes, thank you. I'm sure Mr. Trotter can update. Mr. Trotter.
Yes, through you, Mr. Mayor. So as Mr. Milburn indicated, we have been doing a massive amount of work in that the water and particularly the sewer space. We have two very significant projects, one being Stewart's Point and one Central Kempsey. Together, they are, combined just over that $200 million together. So, so with that, there's many different factors that we've had at the modelling of how we can do these, roll out these projects. There's things we've got to take in pollution reduction programs issued by the EPA to council, environmental and human health impact. So that's Stewart's Point. Is that number one project as it's an unsewered scheme, and unsewered scheme. So that's the reason for that prioritisation within the fund. We've looked at many different ways of actually constructing and rolling that project out. It is an interesting project because it is a centralisation project. So there's three schemes coming into that one centralised plant. So with that, we've looked at many options of bringing them over one by one, or just one entire project. There's a sort of procurement, contractual, and process risks in splitting the project into those 3 staged portions. So it's been decided that we go along with the full project at once, basically because of the the risks involved of not doing it that way. Plus, like I said, 2 of those schemes are under pollution reduction programs as well at the moment.
Thank you. Yeah, guys, add to what you were talking about there, Mr. We've got the good news in the last week. I've already told councils this, but I think it should be public that the Minister for Water is coming to Kempsey to talk to us about the financial situation with our long-term plan to replace the sewage works at Central Kempsey, and we're hopeful. We can't assume anything, and this is a question I would like to ask you about assumptions, but we can't assume we're going to get any benefit from that, but we're hopeful that we will get a benefit from having the Minister for Water come here and find out the dire straits we have with financing a huge cost to replace the treatment works at West Kempsey with a new centralised one. Mr. Mitchell? Yes. Yes, we already have met with Minister Jackson, as the General Manager just reminded me, and this is a second meeting. We're certainly doing our best to try and get the finances for our sewage and water healthy state. And Mr. Mitchell, please.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. I think I neglected to answer one part of your question, Councillor Bain, which is in what's the impact if we reduce borrowing. So I guess as I mentioned in my answer, if an SRV was to be successful, that would obviously reduce the need for borrowings. In the absence of that, then you would essentially not have the cash to do the asset management work that we're saying is actually important. And so it would come back to the answer that the General Manager gave, I guess, in relation to that Plan B to Councillor Butterfield's question, would be that there need to be a consideration of significant service level reductions to be able to balance our financial and make sure we're spending what money we do have available in the absolute most critical areas, but other services would therefore be impacted.
Thanks. Yeah,
Thank you.
can I speak to that?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. That's I am very clear that the documentation and the borrowing that I was talking about does relate to the general fund and wasn't related to water and sewage. It is 0.3 million currently, and with the projection of 6.8, that is only the general fund, not including water and sewer. Just to be very, and thank you for the clarification on that, that we need to understand that the SRV documentation is not related to water and sewer, it's related to general fund. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. And thank you, Mr. Trotter, for sometimes staging a project can be ineffective, and doing it all in one go can reduce that risk. Yeah, so basically the projected borrowing is what would be needed to maintain our general fund, which the major asset is the road network, correct?
Correct.
Yep. So it would be mainly and it would maintain current service levels, not include improvements to roads. We would just be maintaining current service levels with that, an assumption that we don't use the SRV, that we had to borrow that amount of money, would still just maintain service levels, not improve. Is that correct?
Correct.
And how do we communicate progress of our road maintenance or our asset maintenance in the general fund to the community if a SRV is successful or unsuccessful? So let's say, for example, if it's successful, how we do that? That's a commitment we've made to our community that we're going to maintain those roads. How do we communicate that effectively to our residents and ratepayers?
Mr. Mitchell, please.
Through you, Mr. Mayor. Yeah, so in the case that a special rate variation is approved, then part of the requirements of that approval as part of that instrument is that we need to report on the progress of that, and that gets reported as part of our annual report. So Part B of our annual report is where there's an update that's provided on an annual basis in relation to any of those special rate variations that have been approved. So if you look at current year's Part B, you'll see that in relation to previous SRV and also in relation to the environmental levy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Right, I'll ask a couple of questions if I may, and then I'll hand over to Councillor White to ask her further questions. On the long-term financial plan, we've got some assumptions, and they are outlined from page 17, revenue forecast and assumptions. What's the general principle behind the assumptions? Are we hopeful, or are we negative about what might happen into the future? Mr. Mitchell.
Through you, Mr. Mayor. What we do when we prepare the long-term financial plan every year is obviously we review all of our assumptions and inputs. And the base case is reflecting what we think is the most likely outcome. Now, there will be, and I know some of the public submissions indicated that they thought in some cases they might be overly conservative. In some cases, we need to be, sorry, let me go back. We always take the view of making sure that the assumptions reflect what we think is the most likely outcome. But we will not be overly aggressive in terms of some of the assumptions, particularly if it's in relation to revenue or income, for example. And that's why for the from a rates perspective, what we forecast beyond the known rate peg is for rates to increase at 2.5%. To forecast anything greater than that, we don't actually have any certainty around that. So to do that will potentially make the situation look a lot better than what it likely will be. And we know from past rate pegs that over the last 20 years, this year's the first rate peg that's ever been more than 4%. So in previous years, every single rate peg has been much lower than that. And so we take into account the information we know, but we're obviously conscious of not being too aggressive in terms of from an income perspective, because it will potentially provide an unrealistic future view as to our financial position. Now, obviously, we'd update that annually, and to the extent that changes, then we reflect that in. Just want to also make the point, which is in the council report, that the IPART advice is to use that 2.5% from a revenue perspective as the long range forecast, and that approximates the general long term CPI forecast as well.
So in the grants operating and capital section on page 18 or page 17, depending which page you're looking at, it talks about grants operating and capital. Just to follow up on what you've just said, Mr. Mitchell, the financial assistance grants and the Road for Recovery program may change in the future and may be better, but we've just got to assume, am I correct, that it will stay the same? That's what the normal thing would be to do?
Yep. So I guess to reiterate what I just said, yep, we'll take based on the best information we've got. That will be what we, assume in terms of our some of our assumptions. Perspective, we still forecast out. We've got sort of more certainty. We sort of, I guess, assume that there'll be a continuation at current levels of the financial assistance grant and the Roads to Recovery. There could be changes, and to the extent that they are announced in the future, then they would be updated. But at this stage, it's a reasonable assumption to assume that they will continue at their existing levels. From the long-term financial plan, if you have a look at it, it drops off after the first year or two. So we know the year we're in now and next year and even the year after, there's still a fairly substantial number of grant-funded capital projects. And so we know that we will get the grant funding for those, and they are, and we've included that. Beyond that, we have no real certainty around that any continuation of capital grant funding beyond that. And so what we have reduced that down is to a lower, more realistic level, I guess, in relation to the capital grants. Once we get into those outer years of the long-term financial plan. Important just to note as well, they are for specific capital projects, and so they don't, whilst they are beneficial in terms of being able to fund those projects, they don't assist in financial operating performance.
Thank you, Mr. Mitchell. And the final one on assumptions on materials and contracts on page 19. As you would realise, and certainly in road maintenance and construction, we've got huge increases way above the CPI for concrete and road materials. It's still saying we're going to assume that there's a CPI increase on materials and contracts. How has the long-term financial plan been affected by what's happened previously in the fact that those materials and contracts have gone way beyond the CPI?
Through you, Mr. Mayor. So if I understand the question right, we will look at this annually, and we have, as you quite rightly pointed out, have seen a significant increase in underlying costs that have affected not just the material and contracts costs that are part of our operating costs, but also those that are part of the capital projects. And so in the past, we've tried to build in efficiency dividends which effectively means that we have tried to hold our materials and contracts costs at their nominal level, so without building in future years an increase for CPI, so to sort of build into the budget a productivity or efficiency benefit around that. We didn't do that this year because obviously we knew costs were growing at a much greater level than what they had in the past, and so what we used for our planning assumption around that was a more realistic assumption around where that will be. Again, in terms of the version that will come back to council in April, we're going through the budget setting process and the long-term financial planning process now, and you'll get a revised version which will be different again to what's here, because we'll actually have more information that will be available by that time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mitchell. Councillor Wyatt, you had some more questions.
Yes, please. I want to go through this, just the stakeholder feedback and stakeholder feedback. The first question is around the rate peg. It's on page 14. So there's a comment there about understanding the rate peg or lack of understanding. This was addressed in a meeting that we had, a few of us councillors had with members of the community, and then when we had our briefing recently, it says that IPART has directed councils to use 2.5 in the outer years of the long-term financial plan. And we mentioned that 4%-ish is the highest amount in 20 years or so. In 2021, it was 0.7%, but it increased due to COVID. Are you able to give us or give the community here just a briefing, like a summary of the information that you told us about the historical data around rate pegs? Because, sorry, just to context, because there is an assumption that we should use, the high level of the 4% right through the plan. But A, what's the historical figures around that? And B, IPART has told councils to use that 2.5. So can you just give us a brief overview of the historical data around rate pegging numbers, please?
Thank you. Mr. Mitchell, please.
Through you, Mr. Mayor. Part of this, I'll probably be repeating a little bit of what I've just mentioned a second ago. But yeah, so we've updated long-term financial plan to include the 4.7% rate peg that was announced in November. For all years beyond that, we've assumed a rate peg of 2.5%. That's it's not a direction, more so advice from my part, that's what should be used. And as I mentioned before, over the last 20 years, of which the majority of that time IPART's been setting the rate peg. Prior to 2010, I think it was set by the Office of Local Government. It's never been above 4%. In fact, the highest it had been in the last 20 years had been 3.7%. So there's been there's no basis of which to include rates growing at 4.7% every year for the life of the long-term financial plan. That would be a totally flawed assumption to assume that would continue. History doesn't indicate that that's the case at all. And IPART's advice for us in terms of what we model and what we would submit to them should be assuming a rate peg in the outer years of 2.5%. So that's I guess the logic in terms of how that's been applied. If you were to include a rate peg of 4.7% every year for 10 years, it means that rates are going up, obviously, because it compounds over that period of time. Higher rates in the future, if they were to be set at that level by IPART, are an indication of that's where costs are at that time, and it doesn't address the issues that we've got. And so the appropriate thing from a financial planning perspective to do is to go with the rate peg that we know, and in line with the IPART advice, which is also consistent with long-term financial planning principles, is to assume a longer-term CPI-based forecast, which is around that 2.5%, which is similar to what the RBA and others do. And so that's the most appropriate assumption to have included within that. Obviously, it won't end up at 2.5% every year, and it will vary as it has over the last 20 years, but that will take into account the situation at the time and what costs have done and what IPART deems is the appropriate rate peg to apply for that particular year, whatever that year may be.
Thank you, Councillor White.
Yeah, thanks for that. So those historical figures of around 20 years, nothing's been higher than 4. And so that is your evidence for coming up with the figures that you have.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, it's one input. It's one input. So history is not always the perfect predictor of the future, obviously, but it's important. It's an important input in this case. But again, I guess I go back to with the advice from IPART is around using that 2.5% longer term for the purposes of our modelling, but just from different industries I've worked in and long-term financial planning that I've done, that has always been the longer-term forecast that would be used in the absence of some information that would indicate that it should be something different.
Thank you, Councillor White.
Yep, just a couple others. This is just on the stakeholder feedback here. Previous SRV. So you've explained this in the past. I think you explained this in the November meeting, but there appears to be a cyclic pattern around special rate variations for the entire New South Wales local government sector. And you mentioned that the previous SRV was approved in 2018, but that was specifically for the environmental levy only. Are you able to provide some quick comment summary on the cyclic nature of SRVs?
Mr. Mitchell or Mr. General Manager?
Yeah, I'll probably jump in there.
And why, I guess?
There is, as Mr. Mitchell indicated, you look over the last 10 years, you've had nearly 100 or 90 councils have actually applied for them. There are fewer metropolitan councils apply for SRV simply because they have a far higher rate base to literally the land mass and their asset base that they're actually dealing with. So metropolitan councils don't need to access special rate variations as often. It's a structural problem with the way local government is. The impact of the way we currently are is that IPART do set that rate peg. Up until this year, it's been a universal rate peg applied to every council. And what's been clearly indicated and the recent review of the rate peg methodologies is clearly owned up to is that one size does not fit all. So we've got an historical legacy in New South Wales of over 30 years of rate pegging being set by either the OLG or IPART applied across the state that in many instances does not bear any resemblance to the reality of particular councils, and particularly regional and rural councils, where you have far lower rate bases, far higher or far larger geographical areas, and therefore far larger asset bases to actually deal with. So what ends up happening is that over a period of time, because you're forced to live within what's been restricted to you, there is a need to actually catch up. It's just a fundamental financial reality. And having lived through this for nearly 30 years in local government and actually seen it impact at council after council, it is a structural issue. The government is starting to recognise that, and the recent changes in the methodology of IPART are welcome. And will certainly be helpful. Time will tell just how helpful they are. You don't see the state government or the federal government having rate pegging imposed on them in terms of their taxes, but we do. The integrated planning and reporting document documentation process is actually a very solid and robust process. The community tell us every 4 years what they want in their community strategic plan. Every year we develop a operational plan and the 4-year delivery program. You do have your 10-year asset management plan, your 10-year long-term financial plan, your strategic asset management plans. It's a very robust process. If the state government totally believed in that process, you do not need rate pegging. But unfortunately, they have not got rid of rate pegging yet. Every 4 years, councillors, if the community are not happy with the way the councillors are managing their business, they will change those councillors. Councillors, if they are not happy with the senior management, they will change that senior management. That is democracy. That's the way it actually works. We have this artificial impediment of rate pegging, which just creates this systemic issue that requires special rate variations. In the meeting late last year, was actually commenting that they shouldn't be called special rate variations. They should just be called rate variations because they are not special anymore. It is built into the system that is how it works.
Thank you, Mr. General Manager. Councillor Wyatt.
This was raised at the public forum yesterday, and it's in the comment there. It says that a number of the comments that were provided were inconsistent with local government legislative requirements or contrary to advice and direction provided by IPART or the Office of Local Government. Are you able to explain what was inconsistent about the community's feedback, like what was inconsistent about the comments and contrary to IPART's advice? Can you just provide some explanation around that business paper?
Mr. Mitchell.
Through you, Mr. Mayor. Yeah, probably two simple things to answer that directly, Councillor Wyatt. So one obviously is in relation to what I've just mentioned a few minutes ago, is around the IPART advice around the rate peg. So we had a number of submissions that recommended or suggested that we should be increasing, given that IPART have set at 4.7%, that should be applied over the life of the long-term financial plan. So that's one specific item. The other one is largely in relation to treatment of depreciation, and there's some submissions, pardon me, that suggested that assets funded as a result of disaster recovery works, so government grants to fund those projects, or capital expenditure in relation to addressing the backlog should be excluded as well, and obviously for a number of reasons. And what we talked about today in relation to the depreciation questions asked by yourself and Councillor Bain, then we can't just disregard that, and there's a whole lot of reasons for that which we've talked about.
Yeah, thanks for that. I guess.
Thank you, Councillor Wyatt.
Yep. I said sometimes words are a bit.
How many more questions do you have tonight?
Heaps, but just in relation to this one, just couple in the survey design.
Because what I would like to do is adjourn meeting for morning tea. Could you hold on to them, and we'll. Thank you. So we're adjourning for morning tea, and we'll come back at 11. Thank you, everyone.
Excuse me, Mr. Mayor. Sorry, just quickly before we go, just following on from the General Manager, I've just got an email from IPART. They've produced the draft terms of reference, and I would encourage everyone to have a look at it.
It's in our email, is it?
Yeah,
okay.
I just got it now.
Okay.
Just so that everyone knows.
Okay. Thank you very much, Councillor Whittakin. So we're adjourned until 11. Thank you, everyone. Right, the meeting's back in session, everyone. Thank you. We have a number of questions left, and hopefully we'll then move back into open council and conclude our debating and have a vote on this item before us. So, Councillor White, you have a question or two?
I just wanted to have a couple of questions about the survey design and the survey responses. For, I think, just about every document that goes on public display, there's some criticism or commentary around the survey questions and methodology. I think we had an email for the November meetings that have said the survey was leading nature and bias of survey in a limited scope, and sort of wanted that it wasn't an accurate sense of how communities are feeling on the subject to be measured. This sort of contributes to a narrative, again, that, you know, a narrative that council's not doing community engagement well enough, or that it's not transparent enough. So I just wanted to ask some questions around the demographic engagement. Is, you know, noting in the survey that a majority of those people that responded were in the 65 and over category. There was maybe a few in the 35 to 55, which is a huge span. There was none under 35 and definitely none around about 18 to 25-year-old. Like, what are the categories of respondents in the surveys, or is this questions for another time?
Possibly a question for another time, but Mr. General Manager, yes. Well, that's a good thing. We really do need to make sure our surveys communicate really well with the people we want to respond. So
yeah,
that's something we can consider in the future, Councillor White.
So there's no, is there a legal requirement that a respondent must be over the age of 18? Doesn't matter how old they are to respond?
I don't
Sorry,
know.
Mr. Mayor, you know, there's
General
no
Manager.
legal requirement. I think what we do with our surveys is targeting, and in this case, it's targeting the ratepayers, and there's not too many people under 18 who are ratepayers.
No, they're not, but they could be contributing to family situation in contributing to the rates, or they could be paying, or they could be renters paying rates. But anyway, and in that survey too, there's no indication of whether the respondents were renters or homeowners outright or a mortgage. I'm not sure that would be relevant, but I would have liked to have seen a bit more on the demographics of the people that are filling in that survey, or even how do we engage, you know, 16 to 18-year-olds? Like, they will be future generations of renters and homeowners, and also like narrowing those categories so we can really get an understanding of who's providing the responses, and yeah, how do we engage under 35 and particularly under 25? But I will raise those in another forum, because I do just want to have some more discussions around those survey designs, because it has come up in just about every thing that we put out on public display.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor White. We'll take that on board.
Thanks. I'll just leave it there, but I just sort of have a couple more questions on the strategic asset management strategy and one on the recovery of unpaid fees and charges. So
thank you.
come back to me if you like.
No, we've got you, and then Councillor Riddington. I think, or you still no. Okay, right. Thank you. So, Councillor Bain, you have a follow-up. Thank you. We'll have Councillor Wyatt, and then we'll come back to Councillor Bain.
Just on the strategic asset management plan, on page 165 of SPADCO have put in a couple of actions that they request. One is an independent audit of council affairs to establish its effectiveness and expected impact on the future expenditure whilst meeting the objectives. Can someone please just provide an overview on the auditing process? So, you know, the legal requirement for auditing, what parts of the council business is subject to auditing, what are the consequences if there's a failed audit, what happens if there's a failed audit, you know, what is the framework, and what is the level of independence from the council in the auditing process?
Mr. Mitchell, please. Thank you.
Through you, Mr. Mayor. Probably answer this, Councillor White, in two parts. So, because our from an audit perspective, there's both an external and an internal audit process. So if I deal with the external audit for a start, so on an annual basis, our financial statements are audited externally. So that's through the New South Wales Audit Office, and they contract that out to accounting and audit firms to undertake the field work of that audit on their behalf. So the focus of their audit is on our financial statements, but part of their audit is they come for 2 visits. Initially, they come and do initial field work, and that enables them to look at our financial controls. And so obviously that provides them with some sort of level of confidence assurance around the different financial processes that then feed in to our financial statements. And so they do that body of work, and then at the end of the financial year, they then come in and do an audit on the financial statements to ensure that the financial statements are correctly stated. So that process happens annually. It's entirely independent, as I said, done through the Audit Office and TNR, who are the contracted auditors, with oversight from our Audit Risk and Improvement Committee. So, and I guess in terms of some of the items they'll look at, we've talked a lot today, and depreciation and those sorts of areas. Then that. Given the size of our assets, which is the $1.3 billion I mentioned earlier, that's a major component of their audit. In terms of, they will issue an opinion on our financial statements annually, and in a lot of cases that will be an unmodified or an unqualified opinion, which basically says the financial statements as presented are fair and reasonable. There may be situations where they qualify that. So councillors may recall last year, because of our position that we took in relation to the way we accounted for the RFS Red Fleet, the Audit Office has a very different view to ourselves as to the accounting treatment around that, and our audit opinion was modified or qualified for older people like me who've been around for a while in terms of financial processes, and so that qualification was included in our financial statements to say that they because we didn't value those assets and have them on the as part of the financial statements, they weren't able to express an opinion on those. So that's I guess the external audit process. We also, separate to that, have an internal audit function. We've got an internal auditor who undertakes a broad program of internal audits on our behalf. That position reports through to me, but also has a direct reporting line through to the chair of our Audit and Risk Committee. We have 3 independent members of our Audit Risk and Improvement Committee, and we also have a councillor observer as part of that committee, which at the moment is Councillor Riddington. The internal auditor will develop a proposed program of work, and that doesn't just have a financial lens. That's as looks across the entirety of our business, and they develop based on an assessment of risk, changes in the business, input from the Audit Risk and Improvement Committee members, input from the senior leadership team, will develop an audit plan which the Audit Risk and Improvement Committee then adopts, and then the auditor goes away and delivers on that. That's an incredibly important function. It gives us assurance around the different items that are audited, and as part of that, it will identify a number of actions or improvements, which we then report on by the Audit Risk and Improvement Committee to make sure they're being closed out. And those audits will either be needs improvement, and up to there's high or extreme issues to action. Over the 5 years that program's in place, we've have never had an extreme audit finding. We've had highs, mediums and lows, and we've got a program in place to progressively work through and address those, obviously with a focus on the high ones first. And so that, whilst it's an internal staff member, has a degree of independence because of the way it reports through to an independent Audit Risk and Improvement Committee. And they have what they term in-camera sessions with the internal auditor, which doesn't include neither myself nor the general manager involved on those, so that the internal auditor can speak openly and candidly around any concerns that the Audit Risk and Improvement Committee may have.
Thank you, Mr. Mitchell.
Yeah, thank you.
Wyatt?
Two follow-ups on that. So the first one, the external audit by the New South Wales Audit Office, and then you said it's contracted out So the New South Wales Audit Office is doing that contracting out?
Correct.
Okay. And we have no say. So so is there any level of discretion for council to, I don't know, go for some other independent?
No.
But it's not right.
No.
And the second, just another follow-up question to that. You mentioned the ARIC committee, the Internal Audit Risk Committee, has 3 independent representatives on that committee. How are they recruited, and what type of skill set do they have to be recruited?
Through
Mr.
you,
Mitchell.
through you, Mr. Mayor. Yeah, there's a process around when their terms come up. Then we'll go through. We'll advertise for that. We'll also utilise networks as well through, for example, the existing audit chair. When we had to replace the 2 previous independent members, which we did a couple of years ago now, helped in terms of getting that far and wide. Obviously, to ensure that we had the best representation of people who were applying to be part of our Audit Risk and Improvement Committee. So that goes through a process where it's advertised for expression of interest. That's then considered in conjunction with the chair who was in place at that time, but also with the general manager and myself, and that then gets reported to council. So very much the target around that is to actually have, in the same way that you'll have for a board of directors for a corporation or a company, where you'll have a skills-based approach to getting the right people with the right skills. That's what is looked for in terms of the composition of the Audit Risk and Improvement Committee. And in this case, given we only had 1 of the 3 that were in place and continuing had to replace 2, then it was looking for complementary skill sets so that we had people with a variety of skills that would contribute to that committee, given it's a relatively small committee. And so that we've got the best representation that we can, which fortunately for us, we've got a very effective Audit Risk and Improvement Committee.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's a very thorough answer. The second point that they had in their response was they seek disclosure of asset data collected and move from surveys to inspections and a 2-way conversations with the community to determine service levels and asset lifespan. So are you able to explain the data capture, collection and analysis process for asset management? I'm assuming it's some type of GIS recording system, regular maintenance, inspections and monitoring, industry standards. So data capture, monitoring or determining lifespans you've already done. So how do you go? What's the data capture collection process? What do you do with it?
Mr. Jackson.
Mr. Jackson.
Through you, Mr. Mayor. Yeah, data is collected on assets are currently inspected on significant assets on a 5-year basis. It is done using software and through visual inspections. Different types of faults and defects are recorded, which will ascertain a condition for that asset. An asset like a road can obviously be in many, many parts, so it's divided up into much shorter segments. So every segment has an individual assessment on it. Those assessments are then put into a system, and those conditions rated, etc., to come up with those depreciation values and also the renewal requirements for each segment of road. The roads, and obviously the similar process would go to bridges and all parts of bridges. Things are actually componentized down to whether it be bearings, other functions of a road or bridge, so that it's not just an overall rating, whereas the defect might be a signpost, for instance. So yeah, all of that goes into the system. That's updated both through those inspection regimes of a annualised type basis, and also through the reporting of defects by both staff. We do have asset inspector who will go out and actually look at those asset basis to update those things, as well as any report or from the public, which will then be logged as well. And all corrective actions are also noted in there, so that if something is rectified, that's put in there to upgrade the asset.
Mr. Mayor, I'll just add a couple of other things.
Mr. Manager, yes.
There's areas, and particularly our roads, we do actually contract externally undertake some of those inspections, and they use electronic ground penetrating systems to actually give us a really good idea what the foundations and the basis of those assets are actually like, and that actually feeds into the system as well. So there is a lot of those inspections done. One of the things we now know and has changed over the last probably 5 to 8 years is in relation to disaster recovery and receiving the grants for that. You have to have data to show how your assets were prior to the disaster. So one of the things we've been able to do here over the last 5 years is significantly increase that data we actually have. And that isn't just numbers, and that it's actually photographs and videos of those sorts of things, so we can actually see the condition of those on a regular basis. That way we have the evidence when something's damaged in a disaster, we can say this is what it looked like before, this is now what it's looking like. So that's helped us to ensure that we have very, very good data in that way. It allows the people with the expertise in that asset management, both internally and externally, to get that information that we can then use to develop the strategic asset management plan.
Thank you. That's also quite thorough. So there's a range of ways that data is captured, including, which I think is an important one, is sort of like a hazard identification process. So any staff member can report a condition of an asset. Yeah, which I presume the community do that too? Yeah.
Yeah, they do.
Yeah. Yeah. And just finally, in this suite of questions, the question is sort of around, the action is sort of around community involvement. So what type of involvement could the community have in determining the service level and life of the assets? I mean, assumption would be through the DP&OP process, but just answering Spadco's question, what type of involvement could the community have in determining the service level and life of the assets?
Mr. General Manager.
Mr. Jackson to start with.
Mr. Jackson. Certainly, thank you.
Yep, through you, Mr. Mayor. So essentially, things like this SRV is obviously a big indicator on how the community can be involved. Also, yes, the DP&OP lists out projects that are slated for renewals and significant works. Also, the community do provide a lot of feedback. When you said, can the community report defects? They most certainly do. And obviously, there's a lot of complaint-driven responses to items as well. So essentially, yes, the community can have involvement in determining the life of the assets. We do have to take into the engineering aspects of this. Significant defects in an asset can, if left unattended, create much wider issues. A lot of the problems with our assets, particularly in the lower lying areas, relate to water ingress, and once water gets inside a pavement, it can cause a lot of damage. So yeah, it is a mixture, but basically, yes, we have the ability for the community to provide feedback on the operational plan and the delivery program, certainly through this SRV and through the usual complaints-driven process as well. So yeah.
Mr. General Manager, do you want to add to that?
No, it's all
No,
right.
okay. Thank you. Councillor Wyatt, is that it? The microphone, please.
Does anyone else? But I have a couple on the. Go for it. Oh, well, sorry.
No,
Through you,
I've
Mr.
got
Mayor.
Councillor Bain next,
Oh.
and then Councillor.
Okay, so I've got a couple more on the recovery of unpaid debts and one on the long-term financial plan, but I'm happy to wait until somebody else would like to have a say.
Councillor Bain, would you like to have your question, please?
Yeah, so my last, thank you, this has been very illuminating, and I've got my last question. It refers to the hardship and debt recovery policies and procedures documents, and we've addressed the appeals process. I get that. My question is, there is a variation in both documents that allows the GM to review, vary the procedures. So what's the purpose of these clauses in those documents, please?
Mr. Mitchell, please.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, those clauses are standard in all of our procedures, Councillor Bain, because they allow for changes to be made as circumstances change or legislation changes, those sorts of things. So sort of essentially those minor corrections or updates, then it just gives us the ability and makes it very clear around those that enables those changes to be made. A good example of that, which when I was reading back through these procedures, I noted that there's a reference in one of the procedures, for example, to Group Manager Corporate Services, and that position no longer is within our structure. We've removed that position in our structure since November. And that's the position that's referred to in relation to one of the responses in the council report as well. So as simple as things like that, where a position changes or a position doesn't exist like that, it just gives that that administrative ability to make simple changes. I mean, obviously, and particularly in relation to these, if there was material changes to these, then we would make sure that that was obviously communicated and discussed with the councillors and communicated to the community as well. But it's largely an administrative clause that's in every single one of our procedures.
Thanks, Mr. Mitchell. So just to summarise, that means that we can be responsive to change and be flexible and adaptable, and not get minor matters slowed up by having to wait for the next council meeting, etc.
Yeah, correct.
Correct. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Riddington, and then Councillor Wyatt.
Thank you. Just following on from Councillor Wyatt's questions on the independent audit and the audit process, as a council delegate to the AREC.
Councillor Wyatt, please, to conclude.
Yep, a question about the recovery of the unpaid rates. So a ratepayer, or say I present with an inability to pay my rates, so I enter a process, I enter a workflow process, then what happens? A, if I'm a pensioner, or B, if I'm a non-pensioner. So what's the workflow process? Once I enter that process, I can't pay my rates. Then what happens? And then also sort of like how long is the time frame from saying I can't pay my rates to selling the land? Like what's a typical time frame around that?
And Mr. Mitchell, please.
Through you, Mr. Mayor. Yeah, I think I sort of covered this one earlier when I sort of talked through the procedures in relation to one of the other questions. And so, no, each one of these situations is dealt with on a case-by-case basis. So, and as I said, and as I really was to highlight before we pause for morning tea, is that our staff really do, with genuine efforts, work with those ratepayers to get in place payment plans and to help them bring their rates up to date, and so they don't have any in arrears. The process is, as I said before, is that if a ratepayer hasn't paid their rates, they'll get a reminder notice. Now, for some of those, if they don't have, we're investigating, they've got SMS technology, acknowledging that not everyone has a mobile phone, but the main process around that is that they will get a reminder notice to say, hey, you haven't paid your rates. If that should then trigger hopefully some action from the ratepayer. If it doesn't, then we will then continue to follow up with that ratepayer and look to engage with them of getting in place, either for their rates to be paid or to get some sort of payment plan in place. In the situation that doesn't occur, and that none of those actions have been successful, then it starts to move through the other stages, which is where, as I mentioned in a previous answer, we've got a debt recovery agency that works, on our behalf, and those debts will be referred to the debt recovery agency, and then they will go through a similar process in terms of contacting the ratepayer to try and recover those debts. And it goes progressively, works through the cycle. Obviously, we're intending to make sure that we're addressing all of those before they get too far down the path. Then you potentially are looking at legal action. And as I said, then beyond that, the very last step and the very last resort, and which we did November 2022, and which potentially will be occurring again in March, is when you could have a sale of land for unpaid rates. Now, to even be considered to be as part of that process for a sale of land for unpaid rates, you have to have 5 years worth of rates outstanding. If it's a house with a dwelling on it. Now, vacant lots of land, that's 12 months, and we had cleaned up a number of those. In a lot of cases, the relevant ratepayer didn't know they actually had that example. So, but it's a 5-year process for someone with a house before they would even, of not having paid their rates, and so therefore their outstanding and balance would be fairly significant before you even get to that stage. Now, even when we get to that stage, the debt recovery agency that supports us in relation to that will enter into what we term late stage intervention. So what that means colloquially is that they will actually contact those ratepayers and meet with them face to face and just sort of say, this is the situation you're in. This is some of the potential implications if you don't bring your rates up to date, and work with them in a proactive manner. Unfortunately, in some cases, and rarely, that's not successful. And then if that was the case, then it would proceed to a sale of land for unpaid rates. Now, just probably worth a reminder is that in the 6 years I've been here, we've only undertaken one sale of land for unpaid rates, and that process hadn't been undertaken, I think, for probably at least 4 years or more before I started. And the number of properties that we're talking about that went through that process in November 2022 was relatively small, particularly those ones which actually had a house attached to that, a dwelling attached to that property. And even the ones that we're looking at the moment, we're talking about sort of 6 or 8 properties. So there's a lot of work that goes in place, Councillor White, before we get to that action. And as I said, it's where there's been no payment of rates for a period of in excess of 5 years.
Thank you. Councillor White, is that it?
There was just one more. Yeah. I don't have the page number, I'm sorry, but it says other debts, so I'm presuming it's not the rates. This is where possible, council will secure prepayment for the supply of all other services or delivery of external works. Are those, I mean, what kind of prepayment are you looking for? Are they sort of the other items on the bill, like the water, the sewer, the waste? And yeah, what prepayment on what?
Mr. Mitchell, thanks.
Through you, Mr. Mayor. No, it doesn't relate to anything that's on a ratepayer's rates notice of any of those items. It refers to things like private works or which is why they're termed other debtors rather than rates debts. Mm-hmm. And obviously, in those cases, we're trying to minimise our credit risk exposure around those, if you like, or our debt exposure, and making sure that we can get those prepaid wherever possible.
So it's not essential, like water, sewer,
no,
garbage removal. Yeah, okay.
Councillor White, thank you. Would someone like to move that we come out of the committee of the whole? Councillor Bain. We have a seconder, please. Councillor Butterfield. I'll put the motion. Is there any dissent? There is no dissent. Thank you. We're back in ordinary council meeting. At this point, we should be debating. You've got all the information you like. You could speak in favour or against the motion. And when there's no one else wishing to speak, we will have a vote on it. Councillor Bain.
Maringboo, Mr. Mayor. Okay, thing about my understanding of the whole process is that fiscally responsible long-term planning means that we are quite conservative about our assessment of income and quite much less conservative, actually aggressive about our assessment of expenditure. And that creates for us basically, it seems to me, a worst case financial scenario, which is important that we are fiscally conservative because, we don't want to go in with rose-coloured glasses and say, oh, look, it's all going to be great. We're going to get heaps of grants. Although I must point out that we do have some grants in the pipeline. Roads to Recovery, the federal government announced an additional $1 billion, but we don't know how much of that's going to come our way yet. So I understand that we can't assume grants that we don't have. Borrowing, the importance about my understanding of borrowing and asset maintenance is those are factors that are generational equity. If we have to borrow money to maintain a road, extend the life of a road for 20, 30 years, then the payment's going to come out of people who are using that road in 10, 15, 20 years' time. I believe there's a precautionary principle here, so I'm going to support as a precautionary principle and the understanding that it's better that we have this SRV and possibly don't have to use it rather than don't have it and find ourselves in a predicament. I also think we need to have an intention, a clear intention to change the cyclical nature of this special rate variation cycle. And I think we can do it, and there's three ways we can do it. One is by looking at continually looking at being cost effective and looking at more savings, and by lobbying state and federal government to reduce cost shifting by state government to council and to increase financial assistance grants from the federal government. So that's my point of view. I'm not. I've done a huge amount of work in getting my head around understanding this, and I believe it is, as a precautionary principle, a necessary step. Thank you.
Point of order for people putting we haven't had a resolution on this yet, and it's up there that we've carried it unanimously. Could that be taken down, please? We have not made a decision. Thank you. Do we have a speakers, please, before I come back to Councillor Patterson? Councillor Wyatt, your position, please.
Yeah, thanks for that. I agree with Councillor Bain around the precautionary principle as well. And I hear the community's continual opposition to the SRV. I've read all the comments. I've responded to my own comments, all the emails. I definitely hear you, and I demonstrated that in November. These documents have no bearing on the SRV proposal, in session rather. If we don't approve them, then council will go back to those documents that have already been approved. Like all four of them have been approved in the past, and these ones that are as attachments anyway. The next key stages for the community to continue their campaign against the SRV is through the IPART submission, which will be somewhere around between February and the big one, which will be the making of the rates in June. That is where whatever is the outcome of IPART, assuming they may adopt the proposal recommendation, they may not adopt it at all, or they may adopt it with amendments. That will then come to the council meeting and do that making of the rates process. And you can go to previous documents and have a look. Quite a long document called making, I think, what's it called? I can't think what it's called off the top of my head, but it's making of the rate. And at that point, councillors, we can decide to approve in full, approve in part, or not approve at all. So there's two key processes that we have to go through. This is just, this one here has no SRV process or the application. It's not going to stop the SRV here or an application. And so therefore I am going with approving these documents. And also noting that it's an ongoing process. The long-term financial plan is a yearly document. Notice on the front of this one, it's 2023 to 2033. So in April-ish, a new one will come to us and then for 2024 to 2034, it's a continual process and it's linked to delivery in the operational plan. So it's never a full stop, end of story. It is continual. So that is why I am going with approving these documents.
Thank you, Councillor Wyatt. Any further speakers? Councillor Riddington, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. I thoroughly agree with Councillor Bain and Councillor Wyatt. As I said in my opening statements in the November meeting, this is a process. This is a process of an application. We've already voted on the application. This is to note and attach these particular documents which have been reviewed and updated. And I think to the special rate variation application to IPART. And also that's our next stage, as Councillor Wyatt iterated, that we all, including the community and all of the great submissions and petitions that we've received on the IPART, and also focus on, as I said in November, turn the eye onto the state government and to the federal government. These particular documents go with the special rate variation so that IPART can consider them. I'm going to vote in favour of this particular motion. We've got to also consider where we're going to be in June, and the staff have done a brilliant job in reducing the projected deficit down to 79 million. However, I think we can do better, and the staff have given a commitment to doing that and to looking at all the processes and to save as much money as we possibly can. We've got another 4 months to go. Use that time wisely. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Riddington. Councillor Saul, you wanted to speak? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. It's been a marathon Q&A session this morning, but I think the information has been given out to the public and to we councillors to decide what's happening and how we're going to vote. Mr. Mayor, with a special rate variation, we're treading water in essence. We need this to continue, but we also need to be wary that there's no magic tricks coming out of the box. We've just got to try and hold ourselves together. The road situation, I want to commend the staff for their road actions. It's improving and it has been very well welcomed by the community. The point is we need this to continue. We need this variation to go through so we can tread water until we can get some other funding from other sources. So I urge you all to back the special rate variation application, please.
Thank you, Councillor Saul. Any further councillors wishing to speak? If not, I will put my position and then I'll ask Councillor Patterson to close debate. I too will be supporting the motion before us. It's dealing with, as already stated quite frequently, 4 documents that we are hoping, if we adopt them today, will be attached to the special rate variation application documents. And just to clarify, those documents that will be going to IPART will be including all submissions, the petition, and all the documents were talked about here, all the community engagement reports, and they will all go down for deliberation and come back to us for our final decision in June of how much of that first amount we're hoping for to put in to try and make sure that council is operating financially and sustainably into the future. One of the things I get out of all these documents before us today is the importance of the assumptions. We have assumed conservatively into the future. We may have some very good fortune in that financial assistance grants might be improved and we get more money from that source. We can hope that my questions to the Premier late last year about whether he's going to stop the cost shifting to councils, he didn't answer that question. And he didn't answer my other question, which was, when are you going to roll back the cost shifting? When you look at the cost shifting that's going on, it's a great impact on council. Now, the conservative assumptions are none of these will change. The financial assistance grants from the federal government at the moment is a bit over 7 million, close to 8 million. And if we got the full 1% of gross tax income of the federal government, we would be getting 14 million. That would be a $7 million turnaround per year. We can't assume that will be happening, but it would be good if some of that started to flow back to us. So over the long-term years, we're looking at trying to make a break-even budget, and these documents will be supporting all the assumptions that are found in the documents to make sure that we are being, as I said, financial and sustainable for the whole community. We represent the whole community, and they'd actually stand out to me in being responsible to making sure that anyone who has issues with paying their rates, there is help there, and that's contained in the hardship policy, a hardship relief to ratepayers procedure. And further along, it actually talks about the recovery unpaid rates. That document also is one that makes sure we do everything as fairly as possible. Now, some of the responses I'm getting from the community is that somehow councillors and the staff are conspiring against our community. That is not happening. That's right out into the conspiracy theories that we see coming out of the United States at this time. There's all good intent from all the staff and all councillors to do the best for our community. And that's why I think this motion is part of the process going forward so that we can make a decision in June. I ask my fellow councillors to support the motion before it. Thank you. Councillor Patterson, please, to close debate.
Thank you. Just before I do that, I'd like I'm closing debate, but I'd just like to make comments of those that have tried to get their point over against this special rate variation, about the different ways that they have been able to do that. And I do want to make note of the those parts of the community that have not been very respectful in doing so, and that to learn from that and move forward, come and get all the information you need, and to understand what this special rate variation application is about. Don't get frustrated, get information and ask councillors, talk to us, don't scream at us. As I'd like to finish and just say, council is a business. It's a very unique business that has restricted income and really not restricted expenses. Council employs nearly 400 staff. Approximately 37% of council's expenditure is employing staff. That's staff with families who live on the Macleay that contribute to this community. With ever increasing costs, inflation, and cost shifting by state and federal governments, etc., it's just something that council needs to address. We need to address it how we can. Council is a business that delivers its services and assets, an asset value of 1.3 billion, that need maintaining and replacing. Like, people need to look after their home, to paint it, to replace the roof, to maintain their gutters and driveways. Council needs to do the same with its assets. Its assets of transport, stormwater, buildings, commercial businesses like caravan parks, open spaces of recreation, which are parks and sporting fields, which our community all enjoy the use of. The water treatment, the sewer, the expenses of the explained by Wes, the expenses that are going to be put upon council for a main Kempsey sewer treatment plant and Stewart's Point, which is in the $200 million. I'm very impressed in the amount of work that council staff has completed to date on this particular SRV. Council and our community, the staff advising us at council and our community that our long-term financial sustainability is going in the wrong direction, and to get note pre it actually happening to such a great degree is a great benefit, business-wise and delivery-wise. Costs continuing to rise and our income being restricted by IPART to less than the cost increases known as the rate peg. We can only look conservatively, as council staff has, and all us, that possibly the next years to come may only be 2.5%. We need to address this SRV application and these amendments, and I look forward to all our councils to support the sustainability, the future for our community. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Patterson. That concludes the debate. I will now put the motion before us. As per usual, I'll ask for dissent. Is there any dissent to the recommendation, or no, the motion in front of us? There's no dissent. I declare it carried unanimously. Thank you very much. And that concludes the business of this extraordinary council meeting. And I close the meeting. Thank you very much for everyone attending. Thank you, councillors, for your great effort in making our debate and our information here today to be truly considered. And for those people out there on the internet, I thank you for lasting the time. Well done.
And